Good afternoon and welcome to today's event. Thank you all for joining us. On behalf of the Sidney Haan Research Centre for Arts and Health, we're excited to continue our new research webinar series entitled Health Through Arts, Connecting People and Communities. We welcome you today to our third live event of the series, Applied Puppetry in Healthcare and Disability. This afternoon's session will be made up of three sections. During the first 20 minutes, we are excited to welcome Dr. Emma Fisher-Owen, researcher, puppeteer, theatre artist and educator, and Cariad Astles, University of Exeter and Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, who will present their talks on puppetry as a mirror and puppetry and healing. Following the presentations, there will be a 20-minute discussion between Emma and Cariad and our guest expert, Dr. Susan Linn, Research Associate at Boston Children's Hospital and lecturer on psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, who are delighted is able to join us today. The final 20 minutes will take the form of a Q&A, during which Emma, Cariad and Susan will have the opportunity to answer some of your questions. Please submit any questions via the Q&A box while the event is in progress. We will endeavour to review and publish as many questions as possible in the Q&A box for all attendees to read, where a representative selection will then be put forward to our speakers. When submitting the question, please remember to always use polite and appropriate language in line with the university's digital code of conduct. If you require live captions for this event, please click the closed captioning subtitles CC button in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. I will now hand over to Persephone Sextu, Director of the Sidney Haan Research Centre. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another of the Sidney Haan Research Centre's webinars. I'm delighted to have Dr. Emma Fisher-Owen, Cariad Astles and Dr. Susan Linn with us today to talk about the applications of puppetry outside the main theatre when people need us, and its benefits for individuals and communities in healthcare and disability contexts and settings. And I will now hand it on to our first speaker, who is Dr. Emma Fisher-Owen. On to you, Emma.
Great. Okay, sorry about that. So as a puppeteer and theatre artist, there are many strands to my work and as such to my research. I will discuss two strands that, while connected, are very different. One being my applied puppetry work in healthcare, which is more relevant to this webinar, and so I will discuss it in more detail. The second being my autoethnographic performances and research as a puppeteer with disability. This is not applied puppetry, although it has sometimes been incorrectly categorized in the past as such. The topic I wish to discuss and the thread that joins up all my practice and research is real stories told through a fictional lens. Firstly, I will examine testimonies of puppeteers working in healthcare settings from Helium Children's Arts and Health. I will investigate if the puppet, by lending the child a voice to express their individuality, can knock down walls both metaphorical and real. The puppet becomes the child's mirror, one which they can imprint their story on, and one that can reflect out into the wider hospital and beyond, to places where they cannot physically go themselves. Helium Children's Charity sends puppeteers and artists into hospitals to work with young people who are disabled or are living with chronic illness in Ireland. With projects like Puppet Portal 2009-2011, Cloudlands 2012-2015, and Firefly 2015-2017. In support of this talk, I will use testimonies of the artistic director Helena Ugel, artist Siobhan Clancy, and puppeteer Niamh Lawler, Esther Nemetti, and Anna Rosenfelder. In 2009, I began working with Helium as a puppeteer in residence. As someone who had spent a lot of time in hospital as a child, I know firsthand what a scary experience it can be. It was especially rewarding to work in the isolation wards, one-on-one with the children. These were the children that really needed something to do, to find a voice, to express their experiences and or distraction from their reality. Helene Udall states, you have a private space where they are making and telling their own story, and then you have an opportunity to project outward and communicate beyond themselves. And I think that's really rewarding as well. In the world of the hospital and in the home of a sick child, real life temporarily stalls to be replaced by a different, hopefully brief existence for the young person. The hospital is a place of medical procedures, sounds of drips, where beeps reside and operations take precedent. While outside the walls of the hospital, children go to school, play games, etc. In the hospital, these children are in limbo. In the world of the hospital, the medical model of illness, disability, is at the forefront. The medical model links directly to the person's diagnosis and to their body. The aim is to cure or manage the damage caused by illness or disability. However, this view mainly categorizes the disability illness rather than the person. Evans 2004 states that people with disabilities or illness are within the medical model often defined by their disability or illness rather than as an individual. Fisher and Goodley agree, stating, the role of patient's own narrative has often tended to be reduced to a process of eliciting information regarding specific symptoms of disease or of abnormality. When the puppeteer brings with them, what the puppeteer brings with them is the social model of disability and illness. They are solely interested in the young person's voice, their narrative. By being the one non-medical component, they bring with them the reality of outside, while also carrying a bag of tools that can transform their environment and their story into the realms of fantasy. The child, instead of just being patients, are artists, puppeteers and storytellers, transforming themselves into astronauts and their surroundings into space. Esther Minetti says, I don't think it's important because it has a health benefit. I want to say that it's exactly important because it doesn't necessarily have a health benefit. And it's cool, and it can live there in a place where everything is catered for that health benefit. Niamh Lawler, Puppet Portal, stated that the power of the puppet, when used in these settings, comes from the fact that it is a medium connected to play. Things can be done through it, which might not be able to be done directly. Arnoff, 1996, discusses the symbolic use of the puppet, as the child cannot always say how they feel, so it comes out in play. Siobhan Clancy states, I learned in the Puppet Portal that the puppets allow you to transcend the limits of your physical body. Siobhan also stated that the puppet has more immediate access to powers that are beyond human range. Young people can use the puppet to express their desires and aspirations. I guess it allows them to express themselves through different activities that social parameters tabooed or are more frowned upon. End quote. In a lot of cases, you can see a child's story hidden just below the surface. When Niamh Lawler, as part of the Puppet Portal, was working with the girl in isolation, the girl started puppeteering a teddy bear Niamh had brought with her. The puppeteer bear started asking another teddy bear, still in its plastic, are you okay trapped in the plastic? Are you lonely? How are you feeling? Niamh Lawler said it was as if she were giving herself a chance to have a dialogue with her situation. Similarly, when I was working with teenagers in isolation, one girl made a puppet who was trapped in a dungeon and was trying to escape. This was very much inspired by the story Rapunzel. Another transformed her hospital bed into a beautiful woodland 4-poster bed, where on it a girl whose veins were made of wool, dreamt of Indian food and Italian boys. Anna Rosenfelder worked with a girl in a hospital bed who made up the story of a puppet girl in a hospital bed who was, Anna said, feeling lonely and bored. The puppet girl set off to travel the world, a freedom denied to the girl. In these cases, the children used the puppets to express their own experience of being in isolation, made an intangible feeling into a physical puppet, and let the puppet speak for them. Siobhan Clancy, during the Puppet Portal, made a puppet window on the hospital corridor where children, puppets and stories were shared to anyone passing. She found out children would be proudly showing their puppets to their parents, and that medical staff would often stop by to see the work. Siobhan Clancy said generally family members are anxious about their young person So seeing them being creative and having fun boosted the mood and the confidence of the adult in the room and reminded them of the little human that was inside the bandage wrappings of anxiety. The above work sits very much in applied puppetry. Matt Smith 2015, who coined applied puppetry, says that it borrows its concepts from applied theatre and that it is where puppeteers work within schools, hospitals and community settings. One of the subsets of my practice is applied puppetry. However, my ethnographic research does not aim to fit into this therapeutic category. When I introduced my research when I was doing my PhD by explaining that it's situated with puppetry and disability studies, for the most part it was assumed that I was using puppets therapeutically to work with people with disabilities, as this is the more common use of puppets in relation to disability. Whereas professional disabled puppeteers creating work around their own story is not commonly known and as such has been put in the same category, which it does not belong. That being said, as I said above, there are threads that connect the two. The children's own experiences are hidden within the fictional world, and the same goes for the testimonies in my play Pupa. For example, my time in hospital as a child, as well as others involved in creating it, is woven in with how we feel about identifying as disabled, and that's layered in with fictional stories such as Pinocchio. Here the stories created were also mirrors of our lived experience. In this research, the puppets were constructed and manipulated to embody the identities of the participants in the research, of which I was one. They became a crucial research tool in looking at perceptions of the body. Through their construction, they embodied our stories visually on their bodies. They became tools to express our emotions and thoughts. This kind of puppetry, like that of the children's, looks at our own stories, the difference being the puppeteer. The puppeteer working with children in hospitals is working in applied puppetry. The child, however, is creating ethnographic work. Their artistry, rather than the puppeteers working with them, is the common thread with my ethnographic work. Within the hospital and within my play, the fictional stories that entwine the reality within do not hide them, rather than hold up a mirror to our shared stories. The puppet is promoting communication, whether it is part of a performance or in the isolation room. Agency of the performer is a common interest in these two theatrical spaces that we are creating. At the heart of the applied puppetry in healthcare is the well-being of the young person and the opportunity for that person to explore social issues of health experiences that have an impact on their lives. What Helium gives these young people is a tool for them to explore, express and voice what's going on. An ability to transform their environment and create a fictitious world that is detached from them but helps them to work through what they are going through. This voice transcends physical limits and social boundaries and spreads out to the other young people in hospital, to medical staff and their families. Thank you very much. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Sorry. Oh, here we go. And I'm going to hand over to Cariad Astles.
Sorry, I was having problems unmuting myself. I couldn't seem to unmute myself while I was sharing the screen, so I will now go back and share the screen. Okay, so hello everyone. I hope you can see the screen. So I'm talking about puppets and healing. I'm talking about the original and some contemporary uses of puppetry as healing objects, because I would really like to make the case that puppets are in essence objects that can be used for healing. But first, I want to thank Persephone Sextu and the whole team at the Sidney de Haan Centre for inviting me and Emma to be part of this really interesting seminar series. It's a great pleasure to be here and share in this discussion, this very interesting discussion about the place of puppetry in health and the place of puppetry in healthcare. So animated objects are hugely important, I think, for those who are in different states of health or illness in its widest context. And I believe that their power and their potential to function differently from non-animated objects and differently from humans is particularly unique. I've been interested in this research for a few years now and developing different projects and developing different areas of research, and my fascination for it increases with each new finding and each new exploration. So I'm going to talk briefly about three main areas. Firstly, I'm going to give some examples and talk about puppets as healing objects in their ontological or original use in and of their own right, as transitional objects, to use Winnicott's term, this idea that puppets facilitate the passage between different realities or different worlds, objects which can, through some uncanny means, facilitate the safety of the person who's going through these threshold experiences or through these worlds. And I'm using uncanny. When I use the word uncanny, I'm citing both Freud and the writer on puppetry, Kenneth Gross, who talks precisely about the uncanny power of the puppet. So then after I've talked about that, I'm going to talk about two projects that I'm involved in. Firstly, a project for trainee doctors and nurses on empathy, care and anatomy using puppets, and secondly a project for children in hospital using what are called healing stories performed through puppetry. So two things are very clear to me. Firstly, that the puppet does live in a place in between worlds. This isn't a new idea. It's generally accepted that the puppet exists in this liminal space between here and not here, alive and not alive, not necessarily dead, but not alive, not us, but like us. So like us, but not us. It's always in some way a gateway to something else, and it seems to be able to tap into the deepest psyche in some form of the person who is perceiving the puppet. What we know is that puppets originally, the first traces of puppetry history we've got is that they were related to funeral rites. And they were used primarily to carry or to accompany the soul, the spirit and the self into the something or the somewhere else, to make that transition easy for both for the dead person and also for the people who were still living. So they are a way to help with journeys or difficult encounters between one place or one state and another. I think, we can suggest that illness, pain, trauma and difficulty are all life experiences which force us to go into other difficult, awkward and painful spaces. We're also in between in that place. We're between the place of no pain, in between the place of health and the place where we're better, or where we understand and can manage our illness, or the place where we have perhaps already, through our illness, become another self through this transition into another state of being. So in these transitions, the puppet can act as mediator and companion. The second thing that's very clear to me in my work is that the puppet can heal. Experience of working with the puppet has healing properties. Again, if we relate it back to its earliest functions as a mediator between worlds, it enables the transition like the shaman did, journeying on behalf of a community to bring back wisdom. And this symbolic and powerful journey is healing. A friend who is a puppeteer said to me some years ago, and I've reflected on it deeply, that there is something very powerful and profound for people to make something with a face. In making something with a face, we imprint ourselves in some form onto material. In animating that object with a face, we carry out what is perhaps one of the most symbolic and instinctive acts of humanity. We invoke spirit. In animating puppets, soul, spirit, anima, self, multiple selves and identity are narrated, negotiated and played with. The self encounters the world through puppetry. Possibly we could consider Plato's cave as a community puppet workshop, but one where we're sheltering from the rain outside. Humans have used puppets as companions on difficult journeys for centuries, and puppets now appear frequently in hospital wards, in programmes for healthcare education, to engage creativity for those with dementia, and increasingly for training with doctors. I train doctors and nurses in puppetry to develop their skills in empathy and care for others, and to also develop their skills in understanding diverse anatomies and bodies. I would argue that puppetry is training in profound care, to give our whole attention, our whole focus and care to another body, and to facilitate and make space for another spirit is training in care. And I just want to add that in the International Puppetry Association, UNIMA, almost all of our efforts are currently going towards how we can use puppets to work with refugees from Ukraine and possibly also refugees from Russia who are also beginning to leave the country. And for all of those children who have had to leave their homes or lose families, and how we're examining how the puppet can be used in these very immediate contexts. So I'm going to give a few examples of puppets in international contexts which have or do function as intermediaries. The Tau-Tau puppets in Sulawesi, Indonesia, are funeral objects, and they are still used to accompany people during their funeral. They are, but what I found most interesting perhaps is that these puppets often are used after the death of someone to perform the lives of those people, making that link between life and death as not something which is final and completely cut off, but there is a continuum of experience. There's a similar project or tradition in Nepal for the Tahamaka puppets. What normally happens amongst this community is that when somebody dies, they have to wait until a particular day for the funeral takes place. It has to happen on a sacred day, quite often a cow festival. And these giant puppets are processed on the day of their funeral to mark the person's death, even if they died a long time before. And similarly, they are performing the lives of those people as though they had not died. In Benin, in Africa, we find also in funerals, we find puppets that dance, have a very sexual dance, making the link again between the creation of life and the death of people as a circular event. And in China, puppets often perform comic interludes at funeral ceremonies, which also include sexual scenes. But to turn to specific healing rituals, in different parts of the world, puppets are used in traditional practices to diagnose illnesses and to prescribe possible healing. For example, in parts of Africa, particularly in West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, puppets are used to diagnose sorry, my screen went blank for a minute then. Can you see my PowerPoint or not? You can. Yes, see it. I'm sorry about that. I cannot see it. So give me a second. Yeah, okay. And one fascinating tradition which happens today frequently in Taiwan is where when there is a car accident or a boat accident or somebody has an accident in a mine or something, a puppeteer, a string puppeteer is invited to come along and do a dance to bring together the fragmented parts of the soul. So they will often go into the hospital, or they will perform in the place in the street where the accident took place, the car accident took place. And it's considered a very, very important and powerful part of healing. So I just wanted to give these examples to show that puppetry has been and is still used in a very central place in healing rituals. So I'm just briefly now going to talk to about these two projects that I'm involved in. In Exeter, I work with trainee doctors and nurses to develop empathy through working with puppets. I teach them puppetry skills, and I ask them to consider their own experiences and how their understanding of bodies and working together develops through the process of working with puppets. There's a lot of evidence that working with puppets can develop empathy, as we understand that the imitation of actions and emotions can trigger empathy in the brain. These trainee doctors and nurses discovered that handling animated objects with all very, very different anatomies helps them to understand the diversity of the body and the uniqueness of each individual body, rather than treating it as a series of symptoms to be cured. And then they go on to develop their own projects, which are very inspiring for use in healthcare. So one person developed a project for children with cancer, whereby the puppet would go through the same experience as the child, enabling them to understand the procedures that they would experience and also to accompany them on that journey. I won't talk about all of the projects for lack of time, but another project explored the different emotions that children in hospitals experienced, validating those emotions and trying to enable the children to express them and accept them in some way. And there's some more doctors working with those. The second project I'm involved in is a project for children in hospital, again with students who create a series of mini suitcase shows for children, which are based on the idea of healing stories. This was inspired partly by Persephone Sextu's work on bedside stories for children in hospitals. These healing stories are stories where the protagonists, the puppets that come out of boxes or suitcases, encounter obstacles in their lives. They can be very simple and mundane stories based at home, or they can be mythical journeys. They don't represent the illness the children have, but are working on a symbolic level. The children are encouraged to choose their story and to ask questions, and sometimes to make decisions for the protagonists. And the overriding idea is for the children to feel accompanied on their difficult journeys, and for them to gain strength from the puppets overcoming their own obstacles and difficult experiences. There are many more projects that can be developed in healthcare with puppets, and thankfully the use of puppets in these contexts is growing, but it still lacks formal recognition and training. I found that bringing puppets into healthcare contexts offers a great deal to emotional validation and accompaniment, and my belief is that this is related to the intrinsic purpose of puppets as intermediaries and as healing objects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cariad, and thank you, Emma, for such insightful and wonderful talks. It felt I was dancing on the margins in between what can be educational, therapeutic, enjoyable, entertaining, healing, fascinating work. Thank you both so much. I think it's time now to move on to the discussion, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Susan Linn. Hello, Susan, it's on to you three.
Susan, you're muted.
Top of the screen.
I got it. I can't.
You're not. We can hear you now.
Oh, you can? Oh, because sorry. I muted, and now it says I'm muted, so I apologize. Anyway, Persephone, thank you for inviting me. And Cariad and Emma, I was just so touched by both of your presentations. what I understand from your talks is, first of all, that puppets are a safe space. And I think that what that has to do with is that puppets are me and not me at the same time. Cariad, that's what you were talking about. And they're what Winnicott would call a holding environment, where children can and adults can play. And Winnicott says it's in play, and maybe only in play, that we can really truly be ourselves. So, so both of you were talking about puppetry as a safe space and as a place for self-expression. But you were also talking about puppets as a tool for helping puppeteers and children, or children who are puppeteers, gain mastery or some kind of control over what's going on in their lives. And I think that that's so important. I mean, children aren't in control of very much in their lives anyway, but children in hospitals really have lost so much control. So, Cariad, when you were talking about this, the children getting to choose the stories and also to make decisions, it's a way of helping them gain, the jargon word is mastery over what's going on in their lives. And then also with the stories, or when children watch puppet shows or puppets in the hand of an adult working with the child, it's a way of modeling coping behaviors for a child. And so, I mean, I think that it's just such an extraordinarily powerful medium for healing, and I just both so appreciate your talks. So thank you for those. And one thing that I was wondering, Emma and Cariad, is when did you first realize the power of puppets for healing? Do you remember what did that for you? Either of you?
Yeah, well, I have this anecdote which certainly Emma and Persephone will know, about my own son who was in hospital when he was very small. He was very, very seriously ill, and he had to be fed through a tube, and he picked up, it was actually a doll rather than a puppet, but he picked up a doll that had a tube into its tummy, and he wouldn't let it go. He held onto it tightly, and there was something about me recognizing the fact that you know, the validation of his, because he was looking at people all around him who didn't have tubes into his tummy, and then suddenly he had this doll which had a tube into its tummy. And I found in my work in general, you know, with people in various states of illness, that it's, and Emma said about mirroring, it's about, there's something about mirroring the experience and validating the experience of the person who is unwell that actually both normalizes it and also enables them to get through it. But I'm not answering your question. So there was a seed then with my son when he was little, but then starting to work firstly with students in healthcare centres, it just became more and more apparent that puppets have a special power. So I would say I've been working on this for maybe the last sort of 8 years, more intensively.
Right. But you didn't begin as a puppeteer.
I did begin as a puppeteer.
You did. Oh, wait. I mean, you were a puppeteer before you were working in healthcare. Is that right?
That is right. Yes.
I see. And right. Emma, what about you?
So I guess it would have been in 2009 when I started the Puppet Portal for Helium, and there was a 3-year residency in Limerick Hospital, and one of the more reoccurring children that I worked with, he made this amazing puppet. He was attached to a drip, and he wanted to use a drip, and one of the nurses went and got him a drip, and he made it into a poodle, and the nurse got involved, and she injected paint into it, and then he got one of those surgical gloves and turned it into a person walking the poodle. And I just thought it was really amazing that he was taking the things that were part of his medical procedure and making them into something fun. And I think what I don't know for sure, but for me it kind of felt like it was taking the sort of medicine out of it and making it more of a fun thing. And I could see that how he was maybe going home that day without thinking about the memories of making that puppet into from those objects, and then those objects become, as he remembers them, will become puppets. So every time he comes in and has a drip, he'll hopefully remember that puppet. And I remember thinking I think that was probably when I first kind of went, oh, okay, yeah, this is really quite an amazing thing to use the puppets in this way.
Emma, when you were talking about puppets as a mirror, and Cariad, what you were just talking about being able to kind of present the child's situation, but in a safe space. What I think of is that it's really a way of validating experience for people, but in a way that's safe and where they don't have to own the feelings because it's projected on to somebody else. And I thought that was really interesting, that again, we go back to the puppets being me and not me at the same time, and also being like a psychological screen. And one of the things that I started thinking about is what kinds of puppets work best in a therapeutic situation with kids. I mean, my preference is to use animal puppets, and I can talk a little bit about that later.
I've never...
My screen just went blank. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So I'm wondering what kinds of puppets you think work best, and maybe that varies in different situations.
I can't sort of answer the question about what puppets you bring in that work best, because I've never worked that way. I've only ever worked where the young people make their own puppets.
I see.
And I do find that works really well, because then they're making what they want. And what I think what the power of that is just something we were talking about earlier, is that there's not much choice for a child in hospital. And what it does is I would bring in a suitcase, as would all of my other puppeteer colleagues. And the child would literally take what's out of that and make a story and make a puppet. And so they had complete control of the entire situation. And just wanted to add that sometimes it was just really for entertainment. The stories, I never went in with the purpose of getting them to tell me how they were feeling or their story. We went in with others, like it was more of a softer approach where we were creating other things. It was amazing to me how often the story that they created mirrored their own situation.
It makes me think about the whole idea of projection and of projective techniques, like the psychologists use a Rorschach. But we fill an empty space with ourselves. And so I think your method of having the kids create their own puppets is really quite wonderful, because then they really do have control over everything. Cariad, what about you?
I think it's, well, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a very varied response, and there is no one response, I think. I know that some people have quite strong ideas about that sometimes you should use puppets that have very, very minimal features so that there can be the space for more projection from the children. But I actually think it really depends on who you're working with, because I'm working both with adults and with children. I'm working with the doctors. I'm also working with people with dementia, and I just think it really varies. Shadow puppets have been used wonderfully in some hospitals and situations with children who are unwell, and shadow puppets are wonderful for representation of journeys, myths, monsters, and all of these difficult things that people encounter in their subconscious and in their consciousness as well. When I work with the trainee medics, I tend to use tabletop or multi-operated puppets, because I want them to work very closely together, and I want them to work as a team. So they have to be 2 or 3 people on the puppet interacting and breathing with each other, because I think that that's helpful for the development of their own cooperation and empathy and so on. The children in hospital, I quite often work with very small puppets. I mean, I think, again, you know, we're thinking about the experience of the child in hospital. They feel very small and they feel very powerless. And the aim is really to sort of, like we've been talking about, to help them experience some agency. So if it's a puppet that they can actually hold, or that in some way is more vulnerable than them, I think that's quite helpful. But it really depends. Some children can use glove puppets in hospital and some cannot. Some children you need to only, they can't do very much, and they need you to show the puppets and do the puppets for them. And some children are very much able to actually animate puppets themselves. So I think there's no simple answer, but I do agree that to an extent that the more the child can choose and have agency, the better. So I do encourage the children to imagine the character of the puppet and the things they go through.
The shadow puppetry, it's interesting because you're right, Cariad, shadow puppetry does work really well, and when you're making, you can create whole worlds really fast. So in my experience, shadow puppetry has worked really well in hospitals, and you can like project onto the curtain around their bed, or you know, it works really, really well, because other things can take a long time, and sometimes you don't have a massive amount of time. So shadow puppetry for that is very practical.
That's really interesting. I never thought about shadow puppetry that way, but I can see it's so otherworldly, shadow puppets, and it just creates this whole encapsulated world. I could see that could be really, really powerful. And one of the things that I've found is resistance to puppets, especially, you know, starting out working with adults. Have you had that experience, and if so, how do you overcome it?
Well, oh, sorry, go on, Cariad.
Go for it, Emma.
Oh, I was just going to say that, yeah, I did originally from some of the medical staff, because they didn't quite understand where I was coming from when I came originally, but it changed massively over the years, and it happened very fast actually. But the first 2 times I arrived there with my suitcase, I don't think they knew what I was about at all, or what I was going to do, and I even got sent away once and had to go home, because they were like, oh, there's no one for you to see. But that changed dramatically. And for the most part, though, I was really amazed by the children and the teenagers and how welcoming they were. But there were some instances where, say, parents sort of were like, oh, no, they wouldn't be interested in that. So it kind of stopped the process before I got in the room. But overall, I found that once you were talking directly mainly to the child or the teenager, they were very open to working with you. That was my experience.
Cariad, has your experience been similar working with the doctors?
No, they were very keen to try it. I mean, I have to say that they had chosen to do this because all of the doctors have a selection of arts-based units. So the doctors and the nurse, well, the doctors that I've worked with had all chosen it. The nurses have not all chosen it. So, but they were very interested and very willing and keen to try it out. But sometimes I have the experience when working with adults that they say, oh, I hate puppets, or I'm scared of them, or, you know, I can't go near them. And I just think that that's a really healthy response, and I tell them that because it is to do with the uncanniness of puppets. And so I say your response is actually recognizing the power of the puppet, and I don't force them to get involved. But they say, can I watch? And I say yes, and usually they end up getting involved. I think I've had a bit more resistance from teenagers than adults, to be honest, because teenagers have to be cool and stuff. And so then you know, you can find ways of engaging them as well, you know, through you know, puppets talking about sex and drugs or things that they want to talk about, and also through showing them the mechanisms sometimes, because you know, then it looks more difficult and adult. So yeah,
I think oh, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that
at this point, I would like to thank you all for this very organic discussion. And I'm sorry I have to cut you here, but only for a second, because you will still be with us for another 15 or 20 minutes. We have some questions from the people who are attending your wonderful presentations and your discussion. So I think it's about time to hear some of those questions, and then it will be on to you to decide who will go first and how you're going to answer them. So I will now hand it over to Charlotte and Di, who have read the questions on our Q&A section, and they're going to give you some of those. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question. I think it's more directed towards Cariad, but somebody would like to know if you could go a little further about what tools you use to measure healing.
That's a very interesting question, and probably it's a PhD thesis. I think, you know, I would use healing in its widest possible context. I would use the term healing to refer to increased well-being. So tools in terms of measuring, which is notoriously difficult in the arts to sort of have these finite measurements, would largely be qualitative and would respond to the people's actual experiences of narrating their sense of well-being following an intervention of some sort, which might be them talking about it, or it might be the comments by the medical staff taking care of them, or it might be our own perception of their enjoyment of the experience. I'm very mindful of the idea, especially when I've been working with people with dementia, of this idea that a series of pleasurable moments will build up in the brain's memory, emotion memory. If people have a series of enjoyable experiences through engagement, then hopefully that will build on their deep sense of well-being. But you know, this is a debate that the arts are having with medicine in an ongoing way, because we can't do randomized controlled trials in the same way as medicine is measured. So we have to use qualitative methods. I won't talk longer because it's a very, very big topic, but that's a little bit of an answer towards it.
We have another question. Thank you, Cariad. We have another question from Daniel Stolfi. This is for both Emma and Cariad. How do either of you work with stigma issues with children?
I'm just, no, is my answer. I very much go in there. I don't have any training as a therapist or anything like that. And so I am very much an artist working with other younger artists. So I wouldn't really have, and I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer that question.
I mean, I'm also not a trained therapist in any way, but I'll just mention a particular project that I was working on with a psychologist, which was about children and young people's perception of their body image, where we worked with them drawing bodies, basically drawing their bodies, drawing bodies of others, and then making puppets from these drawings, and using these puppets to engage in conversations about bodies and how they perceived themselves. And I think also in relation to certainly when working with the training and the doctors and the nurses who are working with all kinds of unusual bodies made of objects, bodies which have, you know, bits missing, bodies which have very long arms or whatever. We discuss that. We discuss that in the training. It's one of the main things is that we're sort of working with, is this idea of understanding the diversity of bodies and the value of diverse bodies. And so, yeah, I mean, these questions are just such big topics, aren't they? But those are some of my experiences.
Thanks, Cariad. We have a question for Emma from Nina Worthington. So she's really interested in the intersections across arts and health and disability studies and lived experience. So she wondered a couple of things, but the first one was, how do you think the future work of artists in healthcare might be better informed by disability studies? And the second question was, how do you feel your lived experiences of disability has layered the puppetry stories you created?
So to go back to the first question.
Yeah, it was how do you think the future work of artists in healthcare might be better informed by disability studies?
I think by working or talking and collaborating with people with disabilities and with healthcare issues, I think that you can have far more understanding of so if you engage with disability studies and you engage with people with disabilities, then you will have far more understanding of what it is to have one. And then when you are working with the child, you will have a better understanding of what that child is engaged in. I think for me, having a disability and being in and having that experience of being a child in hospital as a young person really helped when I was within the hospital, because I was able. It wasn't just a one-way conversation. I was able to share my experience, but not just it doesn't mean that every person working in that environment needs to have been in hospital themselves as a child, or an adult would work, or we all know someone who's been in hospital, or so I think having a discussion with those people, or having a better understanding before you go into those environments of what it is to live with a chronic health condition or disability is really valid and important. The second question was about my own art form. Could you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yes, it was how do you feel that your lived experience of disability has layered the puppetry stories that you've created?
Well, they've directly, they didn't at first, but as of Pupa, which was the play I created in my PhD, that was directly influenced by having a disability. And it was, and I collaborated with 5 other artists who also had disability and another artist that didn't, to create the play. And that was our story, our stories, and they were put in a sort of a context of fairy tales around them. And so it directly influenced that entire play. It doesn't influence all my work, but I think since I've done that play, it has influenced my approach to work. I think it's very important it's Johnny Soldano. I went to a talk actually right at the beginning of my PhD, and he was talking about how when you're in a room and you're talking to somebody about their story and you want their story, it's really important to tell your story first. And that really stuck to me. I was just like, yeah, it's really important that when you're engaging with people that you're not asking for them to sort of tell you all the stories. And so when I was doing Pupa, originally my story wasn't really part of it, which is kind of crazy because I realized eventually that was what influenced me to do it. And then since then, I've really kept that at the heart of my approach when I'm working with testimonies, and even if it's not around disability. I don't know if I've answered the question, hopefully.
Thanks, Emma. We've got a question, I think it's for both of you, from Nina Atkinson, who's a colleague in the School of Creative Arts and Industries here. She said, I'd like to hear a little more about empathy gained from the puppetry work. That's for either of you.
Shall I go, Emma, first?
Yeah.
Well, I went to a talk about 10 years ago in New York between a neuroscientist and an amazing New York puppeteer, Roman Pasca, where they started talking about the fact that when people are doing puppetry, there's been some research done on brain imaging when people are working with puppets and how the neuroreceptors in the brain are affected. And it was just so fascinating to hear that when people are actively involved in animating puppets, the same neuroreceptors and the same sort of images, brain imaging, they put electrodes on their head, and the same sort of effect is happening as when people are watching an emotional film, or when they're actually involved in helping somebody. And this I found very, very exciting. So I went away and sort of started looking into it a little bit more. And this research it's quite, you know, it's trickling in, this research about how we understand the brain. And I think this is going to be one of the big things in the future, basically. But it seems that by imitating, copying, and sort of putting ourselves in the shoes of another being, we activate empathy in our brain in some way. And in relation to the training with the doctors, I would just say that a group of people, 2 or 3 people or 4 people or 5 people working on the same puppet, all having the same focus and the same care and attention towards another body, are also triggering an empathetic process where they are actually they're deliberately trying to make that puppet work in some way. So they're deliberately trying to communicate silently, usually, with their fellow puppeteers and operators of the puppet. So there's a very powerful communication process that's going on, which is often physical, where they're listening to each other, listening to each other's breathing, listening and feeling each other's movements, and working in very close communication with each other. So I think this also activates empathy in some way, because of the very, very profound active listening, and I'm going to add active feeling process that's going on, where they're deliberately focusing all their attention on someone, if we can call the puppet someone and something else, and also on each other as well. Emma, do you want to add anything?
Where I haven't directly done any work around empathy. I remember when we were doing Pupa, and the actor that was working with me, Connor Madden, he talked about how these stories that we were telling, because we were telling our own stories, but we were also telling other people's stories, you know, we had to be very respectful of them. Usually when you take on a role that isn't, that is completely fictitious, you can kind of bring your own energy a lot to it, but he was very interesting at it. I think it does come down to empathy of sort of the people's stories, and you're putting on their shoes almost, and what that brings out and what you learn from that. And so I think it's similar to what Cariad was saying, you know, the puppet, you're performing with the puppet, and that connection, especially if it's real people's stories, can really bring out empathy. There's also an amazing project. I was at a talk by Carl, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Keister, and Karen Torley, who's the puppeteer, and they're creating a really interesting project in Northern Ireland around empathy and nursing. So if you're really interested in empathy and nursing, that's an amazing project to look up. Really interesting what they're doing there, and Matt as well is involved. There's quite a few puppeteers that are involved in this project, and it's really quite fascinating.
Can I add one little comment as well? I think that there's something about the incredible vulnerability of the puppet as well. The puppet depends upon others. The puppet needs others to be animated, and I think that it's empowering to sort of and does trigger empathy to assist something that is more vulnerable than yourself. And there is that sense with the puppet that it needs others. It needs others in order to live. So it's I think anything which is that vulnerable sort of triggers empathy in some way.
At this point, I would like to thank you all for this fascinating discussion, very organic, and it flew so quickly. I wish we had another hour to discuss more of those really, really important topics around methodologies and the healing aspect of it, and the distinguishment between what can be puppetry for entertainment and puppetry for well-being, and puppetry as therapy. Empathy, compassion, again, those are very big concepts, and it would require maybe another conference. Perhaps we should start thinking of organizing Broken Puppet 4 somewhere in this planet. We can find a way to do it, and technology is on our side, so we can organize online or hybrid conferences now. So it's not impossible. I would really like to thank you all deeply from my heart, because every time I hear puppeteers with so much knowledge and experience to talk about their work, I enter the world of Fantasyland. Puppetry is an amazing, safe environment that can help us go on journeys and face reality from a completely different perspective. So thank you for coming to this webinar today. Now, my job is to wrap up the webinar, but please remember that the Q&A will be open for another 15 minutes. And this is for our wonderful attendees. We have quite many of you today with us. Thank you for participating, for your questions, for being here. And if you have more questions, please type them, and one of the speakers, or maybe more than one, and myself will try to answer them. And before we all go, I would like to invite you to the next of Sidney de Haan Research Centre's research webinar. It's the last of this academic year. It's taking place in June, on the 8th of June, and it's about future stories. Co-designing virtual reality using VR experiences with young people between the age of 12 to 21 who face serious illnesses in hospitals in Australia. We are presenting part of the findings from the pilot study. The speaker is Professor Michael Balfour, who leads the project. He now is leading the main study, and we are delighted to have him with us in June. And he will be joined by Emerita Professor Robin Ewin from Australia to discuss that project. So until then, again, I would like to thank the wonderful speakers, our attendees, as well as our fantastic backstage group of producers, Di White, Lars Maigero, and Charlotte Granger. Thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you again in our next webinar. Goodbye.
He's eaten very well.